I come to you today as a journalist, a publisher, internet entrepreneur sort of person, but I mainly come to you today as a father and a son. I've got a cheap trick, but it's also an expensive trick, and it's a personal trick. I like to show a picture of my mother, Nana Hickey. And I ask you a question, which I'll try and answer at the end of this 10 minutes. What's interesting about this picture that explains some structural problems in our economy and the huge threat we have to our economy? I'll come back to it, but there's something in this picture which tells you there's something wrong. So what I'm going to do today is very quickly look through what I think is the problem, and then I'll come up with some solutions, because I thought today is about solutions to our productive economy. As much as anything, I'm a journalist, so I like to find out what's just happened. Last night, the New Zealand dollar hit 87.4 US cents. 87.4 US cents. That's a problem. The TWI, Trade Weighted Index, 74. The currency is now up 17% since the beginning of March. Yet dairy prices are down 16%. So those who say, the currency's up simply because commodity prices are up, and no worries, we'll just make money on the commodity side, are wrong. And why do we have such a high currency? We have relatively high interest rates. When I say relatively high, they're higher than the US and other places, and there's reasons for that. Mostly because we're bad savers, and because we essentially use a couple of enablers to consume more than we earn. Now, when we have that higher currency because of those relatively high interest rates, enabling us to borrow internationally and to sell assets to continue to spend beyond our earning capacity, that means that our currency keeps getting driven up. So we're in this catch-22 situation where we want to consume more than we earn, we borrow offshore, we sell assets. Those inflows of foreign funds push up the currency. That makes it very difficult for our exporters, which in turn means we go back to borrowing and selling assets to continue to live as we want to. Now that ends up with a high foreign debt and also a high foreign ownership of our economy. And this is, for me, the core of the economic part of my presentation. This is the percentage of our annual output that has to be sent offshore every year to service our debts and to pay the dividends on the foreign-owned assets in New Zealand. And it shows you over a period of 30 years what's happened. Essentially there's a trend, and it's dropped from about 2% or increased from 2% of GDP to 8% of GDP over that time. That means that every year, before we can start consuming the stuff that we produce, we have to pay the bill. And the bill is about 8% of GDP. What does that mean? That means that even though we're growing our output as a country, we are having to send more and more of it offshore just to stand still. And you can see here what's happened. Our GDP has actually grown quite strongly in the last couple of decades. But it sort of peaked out here, and we've obviously got the 2007 recession, and it's topped out. But gross national income per capita has lagged dramatically. Now, when I say gross national income per capita, that means the amount of GDP that we get to keep after we've paid the interest and paid the dividends on the foreign-owned assets. So that's what we get to consume. That's ours, that we actually produced. And essentially, it has been falling since 2003. Why is that? It's because we're not productive enough, and because we've sold off our assets and borrowed so much money that now we're essentially using the credit card to pay the mortgage. And what does that mean? It means our real wages start to drop and our people start to leave. Now this is a chart that comes from Natalie Jackson at Waikato University, and what it shows is what's happened to our population. And the unshaded part is where the population was in 1996, and then 2006 is where the population is now. And what you can see here is that those cohorts should have moved up together. Instead, there's big gaps. What are those big gaps? What do those big gaps represent? People who left. New Zealanders who left over that 10-year period. Now, if we had some more recent figures, that gap would be even bigger. That's what happens when you progressively sell your assets, borrow offshore, and reduce your gross national income per capita per year. Eventually, your real wages fall behind those of other countries, and your people leave, unfortunately. And we have a big problem coming over the next 20 to 30 years that we need to deal with. This shows the dependency ratio, and it shows that from 2010, the dependency ratio, those people who are older than 65 or who are not in the workforce over 18, is going to grow from around about 45% to about 60%. So that means 55% working, supporting 45% now, 40% working, supporting 60% in 2060. So if you think the pressure is on now, just wait for 30 or 40 years. What does that mean for New Zealand? I think it means, if we do nothing, a hollowed out workforce. It means that, as you can see here, our income, relative to Australia at least, has been dropping. That's the red line, the gap between New Zealand and Australian GDP, and the yellow lines are the various migration surges that have happened. And obviously, there's a connection. The poorer we get, the more people we lose. So, solutions. What can we do about this? I've got 10 ideas. I'm going to roll them out now, and hopefully this gets the juices flowing for the rest of the day. Firstly, I think the Reserve Bank should use macroprudential policy to take some of the pressure off the currency without using interest rates to do it. Now, there's various ways that the Reserve Bank can do this. Firstly, it can use the core funding ratio. Some of you may have heard of this. A couple of years ago, the Reserve Bank introduced what it called the core funding ratio, which means that banks have to fund their lending by either long-term measures, through long-term bond issues, or through borrowing from mums and dads here in New Zealand. That means that they can't use the enabler of borrowing on hot international money markets, which sucks money in and pushes up the currency. And the Reserve Bank has lifted that ratio from 65 to 70, and it's going to go up to 75. I think they should raise it even more. And it was interesting to see an economist from Gareth Morgan Investments come out yesterday and say the same thing. I think the Reserve Bank should use the new Basel III capital rules to make it more difficult for banks to lend against property, particularly farms, but also property that has been used, as many of us know, over the last decade to suck in $100 billion in debt and pump it into property prices. These are real things that the Reserve Bank could use. Currently, they're interested in them and they're looking at it. What else could they do? They could apply some loan-to-value ratios, which the banks would have to use. Currently, and this is in the last 3 or 4 weeks, Westpac has been offering 95% home loans again. ASB, in the last month, has started calculating people's affordability ratios on a 6% interest rate, not an 8% interest rate. That means borrow more. The banks are right back into it. And frankly, the Reserve Bank needs to act. The loan-to-value ratios are not radical. They're used in Hong Kong. Foreign funding. How do we get the banks to move their funding back to New Zealand? How do we wean ourselves off that foreign debt enabler? Well, the Reserve Bank could specify how much those banks can use of foreign funding to fund their local lending. Currently, it's about 40–50%. Maybe it should be 0. How about a tax on foreign borrowing? Did you know that Transpower and Kiwibank have been some of the biggest borrowers offshore in the last 6 months, using low interest rates offshore to suck money in? Of course, the more money they suck in, the more it pushes up the New Zealand dollar and makes exports uncompetitive. And asset sales. As we've shown, the more assets you sell, the more borrowing you do, the poorer you get. And I think, and the government itself has looked at banning sales of land, or at least controlling sales of land. We need to be much more aggressive on that. And we need much more local savings. There's a couple of ways you can do that. Firstly, you can run budget surpluses. The government can increase its savings. And of course, you can encourage people to save in various different ways. One way I think you help remove the stimulus and the enabler, which sucks in foreign debt, and help you run budget surpluses, is to apply a land tax. There's some interesting intergenerational aspects to that as well, which I won't go into here for lack of time. We need to invest heavily in infrastructure, not in consumption. I think monetary policy needs to include some things apart from just inflation, including, what about the exchange rate? Should the Reserve Bank think about it? What about employment? And ultimately, if things get really tough internationally and our interest rates drop even further, should we be printing money? It's not verboten anymore, because the US Federal Reserve, the grown-ups of the world of central banking, have just done it. And we need to look at local procurement, and that means for all New Zealanders, not just for the government, buying locally and being proud of it. Final family snapshot, because my 10 minutes, I'm sure, is nearly up. Remember I asked you this question right at the start? What in this picture shows you we have a structural problem in our economy? Can anyone here guess it? The rugby colours, yes, the rugby colours.
There is no way the photo is actually making an income.
Yes, that's true. That is true. Yes, that's true. My mother, Doreen Hickey, is on a pension, and those two boys are Oscar and Toby Hickey. They are my nephews. I am an uncle. The thing, and the point is right about the colours of the rugby jerseys. The trouble is, it's not rugby. It's AFL. So those two jerseys are Hawthorn jerseys. They're Hawthorn and Melbourne. Those two boys are in Melbourne. My brother, Daniel Hickey, who was educated in a university in New Zealand, Auckland, now works for ANZ Bank at a very high level, earning way too much money. My other brother, Robert Hickey. Any basketball fans here? Robert Hickey played in the semi-final in the 2002 World Champs. He played in the quarter-final against China and marked Yao Ming off the court. He's a tall black. He's 6'11". He now lives and works in Melbourne. He has 2 children. Why is this a problem? My 2 nephews there, Oscar and Toby, can't take these jerseys off. They sleep in them, they play in them, they do everything in those jerseys. They love Melbourne because they're growing up there. My mum goes, this picture was taken when she went across to visit them. My final line, about 3 months ago now, my mother and my father migrated to Australia to live in Melbourne with their 4 grandkids. Now, that's one solution to the problem. Getting our unproductive pensioners, the ones who are retiring, the ones we have to pay for, to go and live in Australia. It's not the solution on that. Obviously, I lived overseas for 10 years as a journalist and internet person. I came back to have my kids grow up in New Zealand with their grandparents. I have 2 daughters, 17 and 9. I want them to grow up and have fantastic jobs in New Zealand. I want them to, be digital animators, be whatever it is, fantastic, high-paid, interesting jobs, earning money for New Zealand and earning themselves high wages. I want them to live here. I don't want them to live in Melbourne. I want my mother to live in New Zealand too. That's what's wrong with our economy. We need to do something about it, and I look forward to the solutions in the rest of the day. Those are a few of my ideas.